Long before the poets of the West were ever born, there dwelt Qais, the desert bard, whose harrowing descent into longing and madness birthed the world's most sublime epic of the soul, a testament that true love is no mere fleeting emotion, but a profound and sacred spiritual homecoming. Preceding the era of Shakespeare and reaching depths beyond those of Romeo and Juliet, this is a love story etched in blood long before it was ever inscribed in ink, immortalizing the sacred tears of Layla al-Amiriya and Qais bin al-Mulawa. Predating the era of Shakespeare and reaching depths far more profound than those of Romeo and Juliet, this 7th century legend stands as the primordial blueprint of eternal devotion. A love so untainted and palpable that it transcended the mortal realm to become legend. Welcome back unto quiet Antiqua, your steadfast companion amidst the gathering twilights and the silent sentinel of your repose. As the world retreats into the hollows of the shadows, we draw nigh unto your side, proffering the ageless embrace of chronicles that have weathered the tides of eons to find their sanctuary within your breast. Before the great silence drapes its veil, we beseech you to join our hallowed circle. Bestow your reflections within the scrolls of the comments below, that our collective spirit may find solace in the shared wisdom of these primordial echoes.
Long before the celestial loom wove the tapestry of the night, two spirits were fashioned from a single spark of divine light, destined to find their resonance amidst the shifting dunes of the Nejd. They did not merely meet, they remembered one another, as if their acquaintance had been written in the stars eons before their mortal frames were cast from the desert clay. In the quiet gaze of childhood, there existed a silent language that predated the invention of speech, a recognition so profound that it rendered the rest of the world a mere shadow in their presence. It was a union decreed by the heavens, a cosmic alignment that promised a love as vast as the firmament, yet as intimate as a heartbeat. Within the cool, shadowed corridors of the madrasa, where the air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and the chanting of sacred verses, their innocence found a dwelling place. While other children sought the fleeting joys of the midday sun, Qais and Layla sat in a shared silence that was more eloquent than any scripture ever penned by the hands of men. To them, the ink on their tablets was not merely for lessons, but a medium to trace the invisible contours of an affection that was rapidly outgrowing the confines of their young chests. The school became a cathedral of the heart, a sanctuary where every glance was a prayer and every shared breath was a testament to a bond that the world would soon deem a transgression. No formal vows were exchanged under the witness of elders, yet a covenant was etched upon the inner walls of their spirits, as indelible as the ancient carvings upon the silent stones of the wilderness. It was a pact signed in the ethereal ink of longing, a promise that they would belong to one another even if the tides of time and the cruelty of fate conspired to tear their hands asunder. They walked through the days with a secret knowledge, a hidden treasury of shared smiles and whispered hopes that formed the foundation of a kingdom where only the two of them reigned supreme. This unspoken oath was the bedrock of their existence, a pillar of fire that would eventually lead them through the darkest valleys of their coming tribulations. Layla moved through the encampment with the ethereal grace of a gazelle,
her every gesture a silent melody that harmonized with the primordial rhythms of the desert winds. She was a flower blooming in the harshest of terrains, a testament to beauty's resilience against the scorching sun and the biting sands of a world that demanded conformity. In the eyes of Qais, she was not merely a mortal girl, but the embodiment of the divine feminine, a celestial muse whose presence turned the mundane chores of the day into a series of sacred rituals. Her modesty was a veil that only served to illuminate the radiance of her spirit, a light so pure that it beckoned Qais to lose himself in the labyrinth of her soul. As the horizon of childhood began to fade like a desert mirage, the dormant volcano of Qais's genius began to stir, fueled by the intoxicating wine of his devotion to Layla. The reed pen in his hand became an extension of his beating heart, crying out in verses that captured the very essence of the stars and the melancholic sigh of the evening breeze. He realized that his life was no longer his own. It had become a sacrificial offering at the altar of a love that demanded the total annihilation of the self. Every word he wrote was a brick in the monument he was building to her glory, a literary cathedral that would stand long after the tribes of the Nejd had been scattered to the four corners of the earth.
In the assembly of their kin, where words were guarded by the sentinels of tradition, Qais and Layla perfected the art of the silent dialogue. Their glances were not merely visual encounters, but ethereal bridges spanning the chasm of social decorum, carrying messages of a devotion that was too vast for the limitations of human speech. A single fleeting look held the weight of 1,000 poems, a secret language that thrived in the shadows of the firelight, unnoticed by the uninitiated eyes of the world. It was a symphony conducted in the theater of the soul, where every blink was a crescendo of longing and every averted eye a mournful pause in their clandestine melody. As they stood upon the precipice of adulthood, the air around them seemed to thicken with the portent of a storm that neither could yet name. The carefree laughter of their infancy began to take on a melancholic hue, as if the very sands beneath their feet whispered warnings of the tribulations that lay concealed behind the veil of the future. They were like two stars drawn into a singular orbit, unaware that the gravity of their passion would eventually lead to a celestial collision that would shatter their mortal shells. Yet, even in the encroaching shadow, there was a sublime peace in their proximity, a conviction that to be destroyed together was a fate far more coveted than to exist apart. To Qais, the scent of the desert wind was no longer the aroma of dust and dry earth, but the lingering fragrance of Layla's presence, an olfactory prayer that rose to the heavens. He began to see her image reflected in the crystalline waters of the oasis, and heard her name whispered in the rhythmic sigh of the palm fronds. This was the dawn of his obsession, the moment when the objective world began to dissolve into the subjective reality of his beloved, rendering all other sights and sounds a hollow vanity. She was the sun around which his entire existence revolved, the sole source of light in a universe that was rapidly becoming a labyrinth of his own making. While the lovers dwelt in the paradise of their mutual adoration, the cold eyes of tribal politics began to sharpen their gaze upon the intensity of their bond. The purity of their affection was misinterpreted as a threat to the rigid structures of ancestral honor, a wild weed in the carefully tended garden of social expectations. Whispers like serpents began to slither through the tents, fueled by envy and the fear of a love that recognized no boundaries and bowed to no mortal master. The stage was being set between a confrontation between the irresistible force of the heart and the immovable object of tradition, a battle where the soul would be the only true battlefield.
The final hour of their innocence arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet realization that the gates of their childhood paradise were closing forever. As Qais took up his pen to immortalize his first great ode to Layla, he crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, committing his life to a path of poetic martyrdom. He stood at the edge of his destiny, a man prepared to trade his reason for a single drop of the wine of her love, welcoming the impending madness as a sacred shroud. The spark had become a flame, and the flame was poised to become an eternal fire that would light the way for lovers for all generations to come.
As the bloom of youth touched Qais's brow, his voice ceased to be a mere vessel for speech and became a sanctuary for the divine. He composed verses that did not merely rhyme, but bled upon the parchment, transforming the mundane dust of the Nejd into grains of celestial gold. Each strophe was a public sanctification of Layla's name, an act of worship that stripped away the privacy of the soul to clothe her in the raiment of immortality. He walked the encampments like a man possessed by a muse of fire, weaving her essence into the very fabric of the desert air. The name of Layla began to drift through the bazaars and the tents of the Bedouin, carried by the winds of Qais's relentless devotion. No longer was she a mere maiden of the Bani Amir. She had become a phantom of beauty, a legend whispered by travelers under the silver gaze of the moon. Her virtues were chanted by strangers who had never seen her face, for Qais's poetry had rendered her a universal icon of the unattainable. Yet in this soaring fame lay the seeds of a bitter harvest. For a woman's name, once cast upon the tongues of the masses, becomes a treasure the tribe seeks to bury. The elders of the tribe, guardians of a rigid and ancient honor, looked upon Qais not as a gifted poet, but as a harbinger of scandal. To them, love was a silent contract, a quiet merging of lineages, not a wild conflagration that threatened to singe the reputation of their daughters. They saw the madness in his eyes, a light too bright for the dim corridors of custom, and deemed his passion an affront to the sanctity of their laws. In the councils of the wise, it was decreed that a fire so unbridled must be extinguished before it reduced the dignity of the Bani Amir to ash. When Qais's father, a man of noble standing, sought the hand of Layla for his son, he was met not with a welcome, but with a wall of cold stone. Layla's father, bound by the chains of tribal pride, refused the union, declaring that a man who had shamed his daughter by shouting her name to the stars was unworthy of her hearth. The refusal was a thunderclap in a cloudless sky, a sentence of exile passed upon two hearts that had known only belonging. In that moment, the path of the house and the home was severed, and the path of the wilderness began to call. Upon hearing the decree of separation, the world of Qais did not crumble. It simply ceased to possess any color or form. The gardens of his youth withered in an instant, and the songs of the birds became the discordant shrieks of 1,000 dying dreams. He realized that the love he carried was a weight the world was not built to support, a celestial burden that crushed the bones of his mortal existence. The silence that followed the rejection was louder than any cry, a hollow void where the laughter of Layla once resided, now replaced by the cold echoes of nevermore.
Qais surrendered his name to the altar of his devotion, welcoming the jagged stones of public scorn as if they were petals of a celestial rose. He understood that to truly hallow the name of Layla, he must first become an outcast in the eyes of those who traded their souls for the hollow currency of tribal dignity. His verses became a testament to a love that sought no sanctuary in the approval of men, but found its throne in the desolate expanses of the spirit. He did not merely recite his longing, He wore it as a garment of thorns, proving that the highest form of honor is not found in a safe hearth, but in the glorious wreckage of a heart that dared to love beyond its station. Within the sequestered chambers of her father's tent, Layla became the silent witness to her own erasure, her voice suppressed by the heavy velvet of ancestral expectation. She heard the echoes of Qais's poems carried by the desert winds, each word a searing branding iron upon the delicate fabric of her soul. Yet she was forbidden from even a sigh of response. Her tears were her only liturgy, falling in the shadows of the night like liquid stars that sought the earth to hide their grief from the judgment of the light. She was a living monument to a passion that was being strangled by the hands of tradition, a queen of a kingdom that existed only in the fleeting moments between her prayers and her dreams. A grand chasm opened between the jurisprudence of the heart, which recognizes only the law of union, and the rigid statutes of the tribe, which exist to maintain the fortress of the self. The elders argued that Qais had broken the sacred seal of modesty, while Qais argued, through the blood of his ink, that love is the only true religion to which a free spirit must bow. It was a confrontation of cosmic proportions, the immovable object of ancient custom against the irresistible force of a predestined bond. In this clash, the world of the Bedouins saw only a madman, failing to realize that his madness was a higher form of sanity, a lucidity that perceived the eternal truth beneath the shifting illusions of mortal laws. The final sentence was passed not by a judge, but by the collective coldness of a society that feared the fire Qais carried within his breast. He was forbidden from entering the sanctuary of Layla's presence, an exile that was not merely geographical, but a severance of the soul from its singular source of life. To be denied Layla was to be denied the very air he breathed, a slow suffocation that turned the vastness of the desert into a claustrophobic cell of longing. He stood at the threshold of the wilderness, a man stripped of his home and his kin, yet possessed of a wealth that the wealthiest sheikhs could never comprehend, a love that was fortified by the very walls built to contain it. As the gates of his social existence slammed shut, Qais felt the final threads of his worldly reason begin to unravel, weaving themselves into a new tapestry of divine obsession. He turned his back on the dwellings of men, his footsteps guided by a compass that pointed only toward the intangible essence of his beloved. He was no longer Qais bin el-Mulawa, the son of a noble house. He was becoming Majnun, the possessed, the one whose mind had been hollowed out to serve as a vessel for the eternal longing. This was the end of the poet and the beginning of the legend, a transformation where his humanity was sacrificed to the stars so that his love might shine as a beacon for all who find themselves lost in the desert of the heart. With the finality of the tribal decree echoing in his ears, Qais turned his gaze from the smoke of human fires and cast his lot with the indifferent stars. He surrendered the raiment of his nobility to the thorns of the wasteland, for a heart so heavy with longing can no longer bear the weight of silken vanity. He walked until the soles of his feet bled into the dust, anointing the earth with the very essence of his agony as he retreated into the vast, echoing chambers of the desert. To the world, he was a man fleeing into the void. To his own soul, he was a pilgrim embarking upon the only journey that mattered, the path that leads away from the self and toward the shadow of the beloved. The desert became his cathedral, and the scorching winds his choir, as he underwent a baptism of fire that stripped away the last vestiges of his earthly reason. The sun, a merciless eye in the vault of heaven, searched the depths of his spirit for any lingering attachment to the world of men, finding only the name of Layla etched upon the altar of his mind. He became a creature of the wilderness, his skin bronzed by the elements, and his hair matted with the dust of 1,000 lonely leagues. In this desolation, the distinction between the desert and his own soul began to dissolve, until the vastness outside was merely a reflection of the infinite longing that burned within his breast. In his wandering, Majnun found a brotherhood among the beasts that the world of men had denied him, for the wild creatures recognized the purity of a heart that had ceased to seek dominion. The lion and the stag, the wolf and the gazelle gathered in a silent circle around him, drawn by the celestial frequency of a soul that had returned to its primordial state. He spoke to them not as a master, but as a fellow exile, sharing the secrets of a love that transcends the boundaries of species and the laws of the hunt. They became the silent guardians of his madness, a furry and feathered congregation that understood his lamentations better than any judge in the courts of the Necht. He began to write his poems upon the shifting sands with a branch of thorn, knowing that the winds would carry his words to the corners of the earth, even if no human eye ever graced them. Each verse was a drop of his spirit's blood, a desperate call to a Layla who was now more an internal deity than a distant maiden. He found her name written in the veins of every leaf, and heard her voice in the mournful howl of the nocturnal winds, transforming his entire sensory world into a mirror for her face. This was the litany of his exile, a rhythmic repetition of a single holy name that served as the only anchor in the tumultuous sea of his unraveling mind. Occasionally, travelers passing through the wasteland would witness the specter of a man who looked like a shadow cast by the moonlight, whispering to the stones as if they possessed ears. They brought him crusts of bread and draughts of water, moved by a pity that bordered on religious awe, for they sensed that his madness was a garment of the divine. Majnun accepted these alms not to sustain his life, but to prolong his suffering, for every moment of existence was another opportunity to weave his sorrow into the eternal tapestry of song. He became a living ghost, a bridge between the world of form and the world of essence, haunting the periphery of civilization as a reminder of the price one pays for a love that refuses to die.
Driven by a love that defied his waning strength, the father of Case journeyed into the heart of the furnace to reclaim his son from the jaws of the void. He found not the noble youth he once held, but a specter of bone and longing, a man whose eyes held the terrifying clarity of one who has looked upon the sun and forgotten the earth. The father wept, offering the warmth of the hearth and the sanctuary of the tribe, pleading for a return to the world of shadows and social grace. Yet Majnun looked upon him as if through the mist of 1,000 years, his heart no longer tethered to the lineage of men, but anchored in a love that recognizes no father but the divine, and no home but the beloved. "O Father," Majnun whispered, his voice like the dry rustle of desert wind through ancient ruins, "you speak of a home that is but a prison of dust, and a name that is but a whisper in the gale." He explained that to return to the dwellings of men would be a second exile,
for his soul had already found its true orientation in the desolation where Layla's image reigned supreme. Every comfort offered was a chain, and every memory of his former life was a veil that threatened to obscure the radiance of the inner sun he had discovered in his madness. He chose the hunger of the desert over the feast of the tribe, for he had tasted the wine of a celestial union that rendered all earthly nourishment as bitter as ash upon his tongue. Left once more to the company of the stars, Majnun transformed his suffering into a liturgical dance, a rhythmic movement of the spirit that echoed the turning of the celestial spheres. He no longer composed poems to win a heart, but to dissolve his very existence into the ink of the infinite, becoming a living verse in a poem written by the hand of fate. The thorns that tore at his flesh were seen as the kisses of a devoted lover, and the howling of the jackals as the hymns of a congregation that knew no hypocrisy. In this state of total surrender, he became a mirror of the cosmos, reflecting a love so vast that it could no longer be contained within the frail architecture of a single human life. As the years of solitude distilled his passion, the flesh and blood Layla began to merge with the eternal essence of beauty itself, transcending the limitations of time and mortal form. She was no longer a maiden in a distant tent, but the pulse of the universe, the silver light of the moon, and the silent strength of the mountains that guarded the horizon. Majnun's love had performed a divine alchemy, turning his personal grief into a universal longing for the source from which all souls had originally descended. He realized that to seek Layla was to seek the Absolute, and to love her was to perform the ultimate act of worship, for she had become the window through which he glimpsed the face of the infinite. At the conclusion of the third hour of his ordeal, Majnun entered the great silence, a state where words were no longer necessary to bridge the gap between his heart and the beloved. His poetry ceased to be a cry for help and became a steady flame, a silent radiance that illuminated the dark corners of the wilderness for all who dared to follow his path. He had become the very embodiment of Ishq, that intense, consuming love that burns away everything but the essence of the divine. He stood upon the threshold of total annihilation, prepared to surrender the last fragments of his ego so that only the love itself would remain, a beacon for eternity.
While Qais claimed the boundless desert as his domain, Layla was interred within the suffocating splendor of a gilded cage, her life a series of ornamental gestures designed to satisfy the pride of her lineage. She was surrounded by the finest silks and the most fragrant perfumes, yet to her they were but the funeral shrouds of her living spirit, smelling of the dust of 1,000 dreams deferred. Each day was a performance of obedience, a silent mask of porcelain grace that concealed a heart hemorrhaging with the silent screams of an unuttered name. She was the prisoner of 1,000 eyes, a jewel locked in a vault of tradition, where the only thing more forbidden than her love was the manifestation of her grief. The decree of her father manifested in the form of a suitor, a man of wealth and standing named Ibn Salam, who sought to possess her beauty as one might purchase a rare manuscript without ever intending to read its soul. The wedding was a feast of shadows, a hollow ritual where the laughter of the guests sounded like the clashing of swords against the hollow emptiness of her chest. As the vows were exchanged, Layla felt the cold iron of a destiny she did not choose close around her wrists, binding her body to a stranger while her soul remained an eternal wanderer in the desert of Qais. She stood as a bride of marble, her silence a testament to a martyrdom that the world mistook for the quietude of a dutiful daughter. Though shared with a husband in the eyes of the law, Layla maintained a fortress of inviolable sanctity within her breast, refusing to allow the touch of the world to profane the altar she had built for the beloved. She lived as a ghost in her own bedchamber, a phantom wife whose thoughts were leagues away, tracing the footsteps of a madman through the shifting sands of the Nejd. With a courage that surpassed the strength of warriors, she preserved the virginity of her heart, ensuring that not even a single thought of another man would ever trespass on the hallowed ground where Qais' memory resided. Her life became a masterclass in the art of presence in absence, a physical existence that was but a thin veil over a metaphysical devotion. In the solitude of her nocturnal vigils, Layla sought communion with the elements, pleading with the evening zephyrs to carry the fragrance of her longing to the one who had sacrificed his reason for her sake. She spoke her secrets to the moon, hoping its silver rays would act as a bridge between her prison and his wilderness, reflecting the light of her loyalty onto his weary, sun-drenched brow. Every poem of Majnun that reached her ears was a sacred relic, a message from a world where love was the only reality, and she cherished them more than the jewels that adorned her neck. She was a poet of silence, composing odes of endurance in the ink of her tears, proving that the greatest tragedies are not those written in books, but those lived in the quiet rooms of the forgotten. Fate, in a rare moment of agonizing mercy, allowed for one final encounter, a meeting of shadows beneath the skeletal fingers of a solitary palm tree at the edge of the desert. They stood as two ruins of a former glory, eyes meeting across a distance that was no longer measured in miles, but in the vast, unbridgeable expanses of their separate sufferings. No touch was exchanged, for their love had become so ethereal that a physical embrace would have been a sacrilege against the purity of their spiritual union. They spoke in the language of the soul, a silent exchange of absolute recognition, before the world once again pulled them asunder, leaving them with the bitter sweetness of a goodbye that was but a prologue to eternity.
As the seasons turned with an indifferent rhythm, the flame of Layla's physical vitality began to flicker beneath the relentless gusts of her internal sorrow. The roses that once bloomed upon her cheeks withered into the pale translucence of alabaster, for the spirit can only sustain the weight of a broken heart for so long before the body begins to fray. She became a creature of light and shadow, moving through the halls of her husband's house with a frailty that suggested she was already half belonging to the world of ghosts. Every breath she drew was a labor of love, a weary sigh that sought to release the soul from the heavy architecture of a life that had become a tedious waiting room for the afterlife. Death, the final arbiter of earthly contracts, visited the house of Layla and claimed the man to whom her body had been bound, yet whose soul had remained an eternal stranger to her own. Upon the passing of Ibn Salam, the world expected a widow's grief, yet Layla's tears were shed not for a lost husband, but for the realization that her liberation had come too late for a reunion in the world of men. She followed the customs of mourning with a solemnity that hid a deeper sanctuary of prayer, for her heart had been a widow since the very moment Qais was driven into the wilderness. The shackles of her marriage had fallen away, but the chains of her mortality remained, and she knew in the marrow of her bones that the hour of her own exodus was nigh. Feeling the cold approach of the eternal winter, Layla summoned a faithful messenger, her voice a fragile reed trembling in the wind of her impending departure. She bequeathed no gold or jewels, but a message of absolute fidelity to be carried to the one who dwelt among the beasts, a final testament that her love had remained as untainted as the mountain snows. "Tell him," she whispered, "that the veil is thinning, and that the heart which was denied him in the light of day will soon find him in the shadows of the great beyond." This message was her final anchor to the earth, a lingering thread of devotion that she cast into the vastness of the sands, hoping it would reach the ears of her madman before the silence took her. In her final hours, the walls of her chamber dissolved into the horizon of the Nejd, and the scent of the desert wind replaced the stifling aromas of the sick room. She saw Qais not as a taffed wanderer, but as a radiant spirit of pure light, beckoning her toward a union where the laws of tribes and the pride of fathers possessed no dominion. A sublime peace descended upon her, a tranquility so profound that it rendered the agony of her failing breath a mere trifle in the face of her spiritual triumph. She realized that her long years of imprisonment had been a sacred gestation, a period of purification that had prepared her soul to merge with the infinite ocean of love from which it had originally emerged. With the name of the beloved as her final word, Layla surrendered her spirit to the infinite joy of the infinite, her departure as quiet and graceful as the falling of a single petal in a windless garden. She left behind the shell of her beauty, a marble monument to a life lived in the service of an invisible God, and soared toward the celestial spheres, where separation is but a forgotten dream. In the moment of her passing, it is said that a sudden fragrance of roses filled the desert air, a sign to the silent stars that the Queen of Sorrows had finally found her throne. Her journey through the veil was complete, leaving the world of form to wait for the arrival of the other half of her shattered soul. May your rest be as profound as the silence of the heavens, and may the angels of mercy weave a canopy of stars above your slumber to guard the sanctuary of your dreams. In the quietude of this night, may every burden of the soul dissolve into the ether, replaced by the serene whispers of a love that transcends the boundaries of time and dust. May you wake with the radiance of the morning sun in your spirit, ready to breathe life into the epics that dwell within your heart. Go now to the embrace of the infinite, wrapped in the peace of the beloved. Bid the world a gentle farewell for now, and have a blessed rest.